The first time I heard the name Palgrave, it was spoken in a tone not meant for ordinary conversation. I had been visiting my aunt in Marigold County, helping her sort through the crumbling archives of the local library, Dustford town records, and brittle newspaper clippings from decades past, when I found a yellowing envelope, unmarked, wedged between two misplaced census logs. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but curiosity led me to open it. Inside was a typed letter with no signature, dated October 12, 1973. It read, "Do not go near the attic. They keep it shut for a reason. The Palgraves are not what they seem." I remember the air shifting in the room, the fluorescent lights above humming as if unsettled. My aunt dismissed the note as a prank, probably a forgotten prop from one of the local high school's Halloween plays. But I was not so easily convinced. The name Palgrave stirred something vague, an echo of a half-heard story, a name passed over in local folklore, always just beneath the surface. That night, I typed the name into every searchable archive available. Nothing. No obituaries, no birth records, no marriages, no court cases. It was as if the Palgrave family had taken up residence in Marigold County for generations and simultaneously never existed at all. 2 weeks later, I received an email from an anonymous sender. No subject line, no greeting, just a link to an old real estate listing. It featured a mansion with wrought iron gates, its facade partially obscured by kudzu and shadow. The property was listed as Palgrave Estate, 37 Summerlin Hill. Condemned. Entry prohibited by county order. Violators prosecuted. I stared at the image for a long time. There was a window near the top gable, partially boarded from the inside, with what looked like a sheer curtain torn and hanging, like a whisper of fabric caught in time. I couldn't explain why, but I knew that window belonged to the attic. In the weeks that followed, I began asking around the town. Most locals grew tense at the mention of the Palgrave name. Some simply walked away. Others looked over their shoulder before muttering vague dismissals. That place should have been razed years ago, or we don't talk about them anymore. The elderly librarian, Ms. Geraldine Coates, was the only one who offered anything close to a narrative. She told me the Palgrave family had once been the town's benefactors, wealthy, genteel, and always hosting gatherings on the estate grounds. Their lineage stretched back to the early 1800s, back when Marigold was little more than farmland. But after 1947, the family stopped appearing in public. The estate closed its gates. No one had been seen entering or leaving in decades. Some say they moved away. Others, she trailed off. When I pressed further, she finally said there were rumors about the attic, about children who wandered in and never came back out. I requested property records from the county. They were curiously sparse. Deeds passed from one Palgrave to another with no indication of sales or purchases, just line items showing inheritance. The records stopped abruptly in 1961, after Dr. Malcolm Palgrave took possession. No death certificate, no probate, nothing. It was as if the paper trail had been intentionally severed. Out of journalistic instinct, or perhaps something deeper, more compulsive, I drove to the estate one gray afternoon, parking along the shoulder of Summerlin Hill. The property was hidden behind a weather-stained stone wall, the iron gate padlocked and wrapped in rusted chains. A fading sign warned trespassers of structural hazards, citing county law, but the lettering had been almost entirely obscured by time and ivy. I approached on foot. The gate groaned slightly under my touch but held firm. I caught sight of the attic window again. This time, I was certain I saw movement behind the glass. Just a flicker, like a person stepping back from view. I returned with a drone camera the following week. The aerial footage showed most of the house caved in, the roof partially collapsed in the rear, but the attic remained intact. That same curtain fluttered, despite there being no visible breeze. Inside, the walls of the attic appeared to be lined with mirrors or picture frames. It was hard to tell. Every now and then, the footage would glitch, frames freezing or warping when the drone hovered too close. A colleague dismissed it as electromagnetic interference, but the distortion was always centered on that single room. Back at my apartment, I replayed the drone footage late into the night, frame by frame. Zooming in, I paused on a particular still. In the lower left of the attic window, barely visible, was the outline of a hand pressed against the glass. Long fingers. Gone. Translucent in a way that didn't register as entirely human. I began receiving packages. No return addresses. The first contained a single black and white photograph. It depicted 5 children standing on the Palgrave lawn, all facing away from the camera. The back of the photo had only a single line in neat handwriting. They never left. The second package arrived days later and held a leather-bound book. Its pages blank except for one entry on the first page. They only invite those who forget to ask why. The third package contained a child's shoe, small, scuffed, with faded initials stitched into the inner lining, T. My sleep began to fray. I heard knocking in my apartment, always from above. I lived on the top floor. The dreams came next, whispers in a cadence I couldn't understand, accompanied by images of a spiral staircase leading endlessly upward into darkness, lined with portraits whose faces were scratched out. It was then that I realized the story I had stumbled into wasn't just about the Palgraves. It was about Marigold County, about silence and complicity, about rituals disguised as heritage. And it was about that attic sealed not just by wood and nail, but by generations of unspoken terror. The letter from 1973 had been right. They never let outsiders see the attic room. But someone or something was beginning to let me see just enough. Just enough to understand that what was hidden wasn't dead, only waiting. And I had just knocked. It was the 4th time I visited the Marigold Historical Society when I finally found a name that hadn't been scrubbed or redacted. Thomas Everett Palgrave, listed as a student in a 1955 yearbook from Welbridge Academy, a now-defunct preparatory school 2 towns over. He was in the back row of a black and white class photo, expressionless, hands behind his back, the only child not smiling. A teacher stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, but even that contact felt off, as though the teacher's hand had been placed afterward, superimposed somehow. What stood out most wasn't Thomas's sunken eyes or stiff posture, but the caption beneath the image. Thomas Palgrave withdrew mid-year. Record incomplete. In a small margin note, possibly written by a school administrator or archivist, were the words, "Family declined inquiry." I took a digital copy and showed it to the same schoolteacher I had spoken with earlier, the one who remembered Caroline Palgrave. She squinted at the printout, her lips tightening. "That's him," she said. "He wasn't supposed to be there that year." The school made a fuss about it afterward. Some kind of clerical error. They claimed he was never officially enrolled. But I remember him. He used to hum during tests. Always the same melody. Something repetitive and soft, like a lullaby from an old record. I asked her if she remembered what happened when he disappeared. No one said anything. One day he was there. The next, he wasn't. The headmaster told us to clear his name from the seating chart. She hesitated, and they removed the class photo from the hallway. Said it upset the younger kids. When I asked her why it was upsetting, she grew pale. Because weeks after he vanished, a few of the students claimed they saw him in the window of the attic. Not at school. At home. Standing perfectly still. Same clothes. Same look. She looked down. None of them ever returned to class. Her tone had shifted from reminiscence to regret. I should have reported something. But there were rumors. About the Palgraves. About what they did when people started asking too many questions. By now, my wall was covered in clippings, photographs, and note cards. Everything I could find about the Palgrave family, even oblique mentions. The estate remained the central image. Always the attic, always the curtain, always Thomas. I began noticing small anomalies in the photos. Sometimes the attic window was darker than the surrounding image, as though light simply refused to enter. Sometimes there were 2 curtains, one behind the other, or a faint shape reflected in the glass, too low to be standing upright. In one image, an 1890s lithograph showing the estate's original build, the attic window was bricked shut. That detail haunted me. On a hunch, I contacted a local architectural historian, Dr. Helene Whitmore, who specialized in period homes of the American South. She agreed to meet at a coffee shop and review the estate blueprints I had managed to scan from a fire-damaged city planning book. She pointed out something immediately. There is no indication this home was ever designed with a 3rd floor. I stared at her. "But the attic is visible in the photos," I said. She nodded slowly. "Yes," which means either the drawings were altered or the addition was built illegally. But more likely, it wasn't meant to be documented. Dr. Whitmore leaned closer and whispered something I wasn't prepared for. "Had you heard of negative rooms?" I shook my head. She explained that in architectural folklore, especially in older, isolated families, there were stories about deliberate anomalies, spaces built to trap spirits, absorb rituals, or disorient intruders. Rooms that didn't align with the logic of the rest of the home. Rooms that held memory like a sponge. These rooms weren't built for living. They were built for keeping something, she said. And they never had doors. Her words unsettled me more than I expected. I thought of the census card listing Thomas as status unknown and the memo that declared the attic sealed, without mentioning how or by whom. I returned to the yearbook, enlarging the photo again. This time I noticed something else, something chilling. At the far left edge, nearly out of frame, was a faint outline of another student, smaller, seated on the floor. His face was completely obscured by a shadow that didn't match the light source in the room. He hadn't been named in the caption. When I checked the school records for that year, no other student was marked absent the way Thomas was. Which begged the question, who was that boy? Later that evening, I received another anonymous package. No return address. Inside was a cassette tape, clearly old, labeled simply February 12, 1956, field recorder. I borrowed a player from a friend who collected vintage audio gear and listened to it with headphones. The recording began with static, then the sound of shuffling papers and a man's voice, weary and strained. This is Dr. Malcolm Palgrave, conducting final documentation of the upstairs phenomena. His voice trembled. The child will not respond. He has not eaten in 3 days. He does not blink. He only stares at the attic wall where no window exists from the inside. There was silence, then a faint melody, repetitive, almost mechanical, like an old music box. Then another voice, a whisper, high-pitched and overlapping itself, like it came from multiple mouths. It said, "He belongs here now." I stopped the tape. My hands were shaking. I replayed the ending again and again. There was no mistaking the final line, nor the clarity with which it was spoken. It hadn't been recorded from across the room. It had been spoken into the recorder. I stayed up all night analyzing the sound. There was a pattern to the background hum, 5 tones, repeated in exact sequence every 11 seconds. I ran it through audio software and found that it resembled the resonance used in brain entrainment experiments, frequencies used to alter cognition. Whether intentionally or not, that attic wasn't just a space. It was doing something to the people inside it. I drafted a report, collecting my findings, photos, blueprints, testimonies, but something told me not to publish it yet. Not until I had stood inside the house. Not until I had seen what was behind that curtain. I knew the risks. The town didn't want me there. The documents were vanishing faster than I could archive them. But Thomas was still there, or something that remembered him. The last line of my notes that night was simple, scrawled in red ink over the school photo. There is more than one child in that attic, and someone had made sure they stayed there. 3 days after I heard the tape, I returned to the Palgrave estate, not out of bravery, but compulsion. I arrived before sunrise. The fog sat heavy over Summerlin Hill, clinging to the iron gate like a warning. I parked my car farther down the road this time and approached on foot. I didn't bring the drone, nor any equipment, just a flashlight and a small crowbar I told myself I wouldn't use. I wasn't planning to break in. Not then. I only wanted to see if the house had changed. From the outside, it hadn't. But I had. The dreams hadn't stopped. Every night, the same spiral staircase. The same low hum. The same faceless children watching something at the front of the attic room that was never visible. Only implied, only felt. I stood by the gate and stared at the window above, the one everyone said not to ask about. It was still there, curtained perfectly still. The wood of the upper gable looked newer than the rest of the house, as if someone had reinforced that section deliberately. I thought of what Dr. Whitmore had said about negative rooms, spaces that devour attention, logic, even time. Rooms that don't obey architectural laws. I reached into my coat and pulled out the printed blueprint again, marked with red pencil notes. According to this version, the second floor ended just beneath the gable. There was no indication of a staircase or ladder leading up. No doorway, no crawl space. And yet, in every exterior photo, the attic was there plain as day. Not a storage crawl space, but a fully realized third floor with a window large enough to stand at. I wondered how many townsfolk had accepted this contradiction without question. How many had seen the window and simply decided not to acknowledge it? I stayed there for almost an hour waiting, hoping, or maybe dreading. But the curtain didn't move. Eventually, I turned back to my car and drove to the county archives one more time. I had begun to suspect there were two histories of the Palgrave family, one official, carefully edited and maintained, and another hidden beneath silence, sealed off like the attic itself. I asked the archivist, a young woman named Erin, if there were any older collections kept off-site or out of public view. She hesitated, then admitted there was a private donations room in the basement, items left behind by residents or their families, usually unindexed and forgotten. She allowed me 10 minutes. I used 20. In a dust-covered box marked Estate Records, Summerlin Unprocessed, I found a brittle ledger book. Inside were hundreds of names, dates, and notations, mostly agricultural logs, harvest tallies, and household expenses. But near the center was a page marked only with an embossed family crest and a Latin phrase I didn't recognize, ad lucem per umbri, through light, through shadow. Beneath it, a short list of names, all under the heading Initiates. There were children's names, birth years, and a column labeled status, some marked accepted, others withheld. Next to Thomas Everett Palgrave's name, the word bound was written in faded ink. I photocopied the page and brought it to Dr. Whitmore. She studied it in silence for several minutes. Then she said, "This isn't a ledger. It's a register." I asked, "For what?" She looked at me grimly. "For something ceremonial. Look at the way the names are spaced. Ritual alignment. This wasn't just a list of children. It was a sequence. A schedule." I asked her about the word bound. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "In early American secret societies, bound often meant irrevocable initiation, permanent placement, like being offered up, willingly or otherwise." Back at my apartment, I did more research on the phrase. I found an obscure theological text that mentioned it once, in reference to a Puritan sect that believed in containment of darkness through sacrificial memory. It wasn't hard to guess what that meant. Not when you'd heard the tape of Dr. Malcolm Palgrave describing a child who didn't blink, who stared at a wall where no window existed. The attic, I realized, wasn't just hidden. It was constructed as a container, a ritualized vault built on deliberate erasure. And if Thomas had been bound, then someone had locked him in with intention, not neglect. He wasn't missing. He was kept. The next day, I returned to the estate again. This time, I did bring tools. Not to break in, but to examine the exterior more carefully. I paced the perimeter and discovered an overgrown cellar entrance, nearly invisible under dead vines and rotting latticework. The door had been sealed with old nails and a rusted bolt, but the wood was soft. I pried it open and descended a narrow flight of stone steps into the basement. The smell was immediate, mildew, rot, and something harder to place. Old paper, old wood, and the faintest whiff of copper. The basement was surprisingly empty. No furniture, no relics, just stone walls and beams blackened by time. But in the far corner, I found a narrow door, barely large enough for a child. There was no knob, only a recessed groove. I pushed. It didn't open. Not until I leaned all my weight into it. Behind it was a spiral staircase, just like in my dreams. Stone steps, unlit, circling upward into blackness. I didn't climb it. Not yet. I stood at the base for a long time, flashlight beam trembling in my hand. I took a photo, which later came out warped, the steps curving in a way that didn't match geometry. There was no doubt in my mind now. This was the access point to the attic, and no blueprints had ever recorded it. It wasn't designed to be found. It was absorbed into the house. Like a cyst, I left the estate before nightfall. I didn't sleep. That spiral staircase had changed something in me. Not just fear, but recognition. Like something inside the attic had noticed I had found the way up. The following morning, a new envelope appeared at my door. No postage, no name. Inside was another photograph. This one showed the attic window again, but from inside the room. And it wasn't empty. A figure stood facing the far wall, arms extended outward, fingers splayed. Around them were chairs. 10. All empty except the one nearest the window. In it sat a child, facing away. Under the photo was a note written in neat cursive. Once the seats are filled, the room must close again. I stared at that message for what felt like hours. Then I wrote the date in my notebook. October 29th. 3 days until Halloween. 3 days until something closed. And I wasn't sure if I would be inside the room when it did. I didn't leave my apartment for the next 24 hours. I couldn't. Every creak in the floorboards above me made my skin tighten. Every knock, every car door outside sounded closer than it should have been. I kept the photograph from the envelope on my desk, illuminated by my desk lamp, trying to convince myself it was a fake. That it had been staged. That someone wanted to scare me. But that spiral staircase in the corner of the image, that was real. That was the same staircase I saw in the basement of the Palgrave estate. I had stood at its base. I had felt the cold draft rising from it, as though the attic were breathing downward. The note, "Once the seats are filled, the room must close again," kept echoing in my head. I began wondering how many had sat in those chairs, who they were, if they had all been children, and who was keeping count. I went back to the photocopied ledger and the column marked initiates. There were 32 names listed over a 70-year period. Some were marked accepted, a few withheld, and 5, including Thomas, were labeled bound. That word unnerved me more now, not just because of what it might mean, but because it suggested compliance. Some of them may have been volunteers or sacrifices. I began cross-referencing those names with county birth and death records, school enrollments, and missing persons reports. Most had no trace. A few showed up once, in a baptism log, a photo caption, or a hospital birth certificate, but then vanished. It wasn't that they'd been erased. It was that their stories had never been permitted to grow. I focused on one name, Iris Marin Calloway, born 1968. Marked withheld. No known date of death. I found a brief mention of her in an alumni newsletter from the Marigold Youth Choir. Just one sentence. "We fondly remember Iris Calloway, whose voice once filled the town square." No photo. No follow-up. I visited the home address listed in the record. It had been turned into a real estate office. When I asked about the Calloway family, the woman behind the desk looked puzzled. "That name rings a bell," she said. "But no one's lived here under that name for as long as I can remember." She checked a drawer, pulled out an old file, and frowned. "Huh? There's a missing deed here. This property was transferred in 1977, but there's no record of who sold it. It was the same pattern I'd seen with the Palgrave estate, gaps where records should be. Blank signatures, vanished documents, timelines with no anchor. It felt systemic, like a network of erasures radiating from the attic outward. I wrote Iris's name on a note card and pinned it to the growing web on my wall. 5 names sat at the center now, those marked bound. Thomas, Iris, a boy named Caleb Martin, a girl named Eloise Granger, and one name scratched so violently into the page it was barely legible. Marion, no surname. I called Dr. Whitmore again and asked her if she had ever seen cases of families using ritual registers in modern architecture. She paused. "You're not talking about symbolic blueprints anymore," she said. "You're talking about functional design, spaces built for ritual retention." I admitted I wasn't sure what I meant anymore. She agreed to meet me again, this time at her university office, where she had access to her private collection of documents. When I arrived, she had already pulled several books from her shelf, writings on domestic folklore, occult symbolism in generational homes, and most notably, a 1952 article titled "The Theory of Containment Rooms." The article described a fringe theory among architectural historians that some families, particularly those with power, wealth, or social autonomy, constructed rooms not for shelter or storage, but for holding. These rooms often didn't obey conventional rules of design. No clear dimensions, no stable heat, often no light source. They were, in essence, built to serve a function not acknowledged in public life. And the theory goes, Dr. Whitmore said, that these rooms aren't just metaphorical prisons. They're active. They do something to those placed inside. I asked her if she believed the Palgrave attic was one of those. She didn't answer directly. "Do you know what a memory hole is?" she asked. I nodded, recalling Orwell. She continued, "Some rooms are built like that, not to store memory, but to erase it. Selectively, repetitively." She handed me a diagram from the article showing a 3-floor home with a sealed top room. The architecture functions like a circuit. Input, containment, drain. She tapped the attic. "This is the drain. And your ledger, those children, they're not just names. They're power sources. Memories sealed in flesh." The idea made me nauseous. I thanked her and left, my thoughts spinning. Back home, I found another envelope at my door. This one had no photo, just a folded sheet of paper and a small object inside. The paper read, "The choir fell silent after Iris. They tried to replace her, but the sound changed." I unfolded the object. It was a rusted tuning fork, bent at one prong, with the initials IC carved faintly into the handle. I tapped it lightly on my desk. The tone it produced was warped, lower than expected, resonant in an unpleasant way. My lamp flickered once. Then the sound faded. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing that tone in my head, even hours later. I dreamed of 10 children seated in the attic again, only this time Iris was among them. She turned to me. Her mouth moved, but no sound emerged. Instead, the hum returned, the 5-tone sequence from the cassette tape. And then I saw the room begin to tilt, like a stage being shifted. The children remained still, but the world around them curved. And through the window, I saw nothing but darkness, like the house had been lifted from the earth and set in the middle of a void. When I woke, I felt the same sense of slow motion I always did after those dreams. I sat at my desk, looking at the names on the wall. A question formed and stuck with me the rest of the day. What happens when the 10th seat is filled? There were 10 chairs in that room. I'd seen them, and there were 5 names mark-bound. That left 5 empty seats, or rather 4, because one of them, I realized, might already be meant for me. The next morning, I drove out to what was left of the Marigold County School of Music. It had burned down in 1971, but the foundation still remained, an overgrown skeleton of concrete and scorched beams nestled at the edge of an abandoned lot near Orchard Lane. I hadn't intended to go there. I'd been researching Iris Calloway's disappearance when I came across a footnote in an archived PDA meeting transcript that mentioned withdrawal of funding due to incident involving vocal students. There was no detail, just that cryptic phrase. But my gut told me it was related. Everything in Marigold eventually looped back to the Palgraves. I parked and stepped over the rusted remnants of a fallen fence. The air smelled like wet bark and mildew, and the silence was thick, too thick for a Saturday morning. I picked through the ruin, hoping to find a plaque or marker, something that hadn't been claimed by decay. Instead, I found a staircase. A few steps, half submerged in ivy and mud, leading to what must have once been the basement. I hesitated only a moment before descending. The air grew colder as I stepped into the dark. The flashlight in my hand flickered but held. The space was empty except for debris and dust. But along the far wall, I found something odd, a series of metal chairs, bolted to the floor in a semicircle, facing a crumbling brick alcove. At first glance, it looked like an old recital space or perhaps a practice room. But the chairs were too small, child-sized, and there were 10 of them. Each chair had a small metal tag riveted into the frame. The tags were corroded, but I could make out some of the initials, TPICSIM, the same as the ledger, same as the children mark-bound. This wasn't just a school facility. It had been a ritual chamber, hidden in plain sight, cloaked in education and song. A place where children were conditioned, prepared, maybe even offered up. I stepped into the center of the semicircle and looked at the wall the chairs faced. The bricks, they were newer, uneven in texture. I tapped one and heard a hollow echo. There was a space behind it. I returned the next day with a chisel and hammer. It was reckless, I knew that, but caution had long since been outpaced by obsession. I worked carefully, removing brick after brick until I opened a narrow cavity no more than 4 feet deep. Inside, I found remnants, a tattered ribbon, a child's ballet slipper, and a cracked phonograph record labeled Choir Recital Winter Solstice. I took the record home, cleaned it, and borrowed a friend's antique turntable to listen. The moment the needle dropped, the room seemed to tighten. At first, it was nothing more than static, soft and persistent. Then the sound of children humming, their voices staggered in tone and pace, rising and falling like a wave. There were no words, just a haunting, dissonant melody, low and slow. A few seconds later, a deeper voice entered, not singing, but reciting. I recognized it immediately. It was Dr. Malcolm Palgrave. The "The sound must continue," he said, voice thin and dry. "Each vibration carries the memory forward. Do not stop. To stop is to let the house remember." Then silence. Not the kind that ends a record, but the kind that consumes. The kind that made my ears ring from absence. I tried playing the recording again, but the phonograph needle refused to drop a second time, as if the record had only ever permitted one listen. I checked the player. It was working fine, but the grooves on the record had changed, visibly altered, smoothed over, as though the track had been absorbed. That night I dreamed again. This time I was standing in the basement of the school. The 10 chairs were filled, and the children were singing. But it wasn't music. It was something older. A chant without rhythm, without pitch. At the center of the room was the same figure I'd seen in the attic window, but clearer now. Tall, thin, draped in what looked like decaying velvet. Its face was a blur, constantly shifting, like dozens of faces layered on top of each other. As it moved its hands slowly, the children's voices shifted in unison, reacting to gestures like a conductor guiding a seance. Then one child stopped. Iris, her mouth shut, eyes wide with fear. The figure turned toward her. Without moving, without sound, and Iris screamed, a scream that bled into the dream and yanked me awake. My throat was sore. I had screamed with her. I checked my desk. The record was gone. In its place was a cassette tape I didn't own. No label. I slid it into my player. At first, just static again. Then a voice I hadn't heard before. A child's voice. "Mel, there were only supposed to be 10 of us," he said, breathless. But they kept bringing more. They didn't sit. They watched. From the walls. From the mirror. From the attic. A pause. "It's too loud now. It never stops. Even when you sleep." I pressed pause. My breathing was shallow. I looked around my apartment and noticed something off. My reflection in the hallway mirror was lagging behind. It moved a split second late, like a delay in a video feed. When I lifted my hand, it twitched, then followed. I stepped closer. The face in the mirror wasn't mine. It was a child's. Hollow-eyed, mouth agape. I stumbled back. The reflection corrected. My own face returned. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk, staring at the chair across from me, imagining the attic again. 10 seats. A room that wasn't a room, but a machine, powered by memory, grief, voices. I realized then that the house wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It wasn't a container for spirits. It was a ritual engine, a cyclical design fed by children's memory, powered by music, bound by architecture. The attic wasn't just a room. It was the final note in a composition that had played for decades, maybe longer. And they were running out of children to play it. Or worse, they were preparing a new generation. My wall of notes was a chorus now. A collage of missing children, photographs of reflections, floor plans that defied logic. And at the center, I wrote one question in red ink, large and urgent. Who is the conductor now? Because if the room must close when the seats are filled, then someone is deciding who gets to sit and who gets to listen. The following morning, I drove to the Palgrave estate without fully deciding to. It was as though my hands knew where to go before my mind caught up. The fog was heavier this time, an almost syrupy veil across Summerlin Hill. I sat in the car for a long time, engine off, watching the upper gable through the windshield. The attic window was clearer than usual. The curtain slightly parted, enough to see something just beyond the glass. A shape? No movement. Just stillness, like the posture of something expecting me. I didn't bring the camera. I didn't bring anything but a flashlight and a notebook. I knew I wouldn't need tools to see what was already pulling me in. I walked the same route to the back of the house and descended the basement steps again. They groaned with rot beneath my weight, but I didn't hesitate. The spiral staircase was waiting, no dust disturbed, no signs of animals or insects. Just cold air, stale with the scent of linen and stone. The kind of preserved stillness you only find in sealed tombs or forgotten churches. I ascended slowly, counting each step, 32 spirals to the top. As I reached the final one, I saw the door. Or rather, the lack of one. There was only a passage, an opening into a space beyond blackness. I hesitated, waiting for my own fear to catch up. It didn't. I stepped through. The attic was larger than it could have physically been. The ceiling sloped, but not in the way it should. Angles didn't meet where they were supposed to. Corners shifted when not directly looked at. There were no light fixtures, yet the space was dimly lit, as if illuminated by memory itself. At the center stood the 10 chairs, arranged in a perfect semicircle. 5 were empty. The other 5 held objects, not people, tokens. A scuffed shoe, a tattered choir ribbon, a cracked lunchbox, a small velvet pouch, a photograph of a child with their face scratched out. Each object sat perfectly centered on its chair, like an offering. I stepped forward and my foot touched something soft. A carpet, but not one that belonged in this house. It was a child's rug, faded blues and yellows, decorated with cartoon animals. Something about it tugged at my gut. I recognized it. It had been in my bedroom when I was 6. I knelt to touch it. The fibers were real, tangible, but the edges dissolved into the floorboards like fog. This room wasn't just architectural, it was parasitic. It absorbed memory and stitched it into its fabric. Pieces of its victims remained here, preserved as echoes. I looked up and saw another rug, overlapping the first, then another behind that. Layers of childhood, memories pressed into the wood, forming a mosaic of stolen lives. Then came the voices. Soft at first, humming, familiar. The same 5-tone sequence from the cassette. They rose slowly, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I turned in place and saw the far wall begin to breathe. It pulsed subtly, like a lung filling and emptying. The wall's surface shimmered, not like paint, but like water held vertically. I approached and saw my reflection. But it wasn't me now. It was me at age 10, standing in my childhood bedroom, holding a flashlight and looking up at my closet. I watched transfixed as the boy version of me opened the door and stared into darkness. Then he smiled. Not with my smile, but with someone else's. His face contorted slightly, too wide, too knowing. The wall rippled. My younger self began to hum. I staggered back, heart pounding, trying to separate what was real from what had been drawn out of me. This room was doing something. It was reading me, matching pieces of my memory with its archive of residuals. The attic didn't just hold people. It mirrored them, rewrote them, until the self could no longer distinguish between lived experience and implanted memory. Then I saw the conductor's stand. I hadn't noticed it before. It sat behind the chairs, slightly elevated, carved from dark wood with twisting engravings, symbols, perhaps, or language. It held an open book, the pages yellowed and vibrating faintly, as though breathing. I approached. On the open spread were 10 names. 5 were crossed out. The other 5 were blank. But as I stood there, I saw a 6th name begin to form, my own, scrawled in ink that bled from nowhere. I watched the letters crawl across the page, one by one. The room hummed louder, a resonance in the bones of the walls. The chairs creaked. One of the empty ones shifted slightly, angled toward me. I snapped the notebook shut and stepped back. The humming ceased instantly. The attic fell silent. Then came a new sound. A soft knock. From inside the walls. It came again. Then again. Not random. Rhythmic. A pattern. I walked to the wall and placed my ear against the wood. From within, I heard a child's voice whispering. He doesn't let us leave unless someone listens. You listened. You heard us. I stepped back. Who is he? I asked aloud. The answer came in a chorus. A dozen whispers overlapping. The one who remembers. The one who writes the names. He was the first, and he must stay until the seats are full. I stared at the conductor's stand at the book. The page was turning slowly on its own. Beneath my name was another, half-formed, as though waiting to be chosen, or perhaps offered. I couldn't breathe. The air had thickened. The attic was growing warmer, the ceiling bending inward like a dome closing. I ran down the spiral staircase, through the basement, into the open air. The fog was gone. The sun had risen, but my car wasn't where I had parked it. The road was unfamiliar. The trees were taller. The house was gone. In its place stood a vacant lot, overgrown and cracked with vines. A sign read, Palgrave Park, established 1981. in memory of lost children. I turned in circles, disoriented. My phone had no signal. The calendar app listed the date as November 3rd. I had entered the house on October 29th. 4 days had vanished. When I finally made it back to my apartment, by foot, by asking directions I barely understood, I found my notes undisturbed. But something had changed. The photograph from the attic, the one showing the 10 chairs, now had 6 filled. One of them had a notebook resting on the seat. It was mine. I didn't remember falling asleep, but I woke up with pages of my own notebook scattered across the floor like leaves caught in wind. My pen was uncapped, ink dried in a looping circle on the last page I had written. The handwriting on that final line was not mine. It read, "The house will rebuild." It always does. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. There was something else now, something worse. A kind of possession. Not supernatural, but emotional. The attic hadn't just taken part of me. It had written itself into me. And worse, I hadn't resisted. The discovery that the Palgrave estate had been replaced, scrubbed from existence and replaced by a park I had never heard of, didn't surprise me anymore. I knew what it meant. The structure, the house, the ritual engine, whatever it was, had fulfilled part of its cycle. It could dissolve, change form, re-emerge elsewhere. I wasn't sure how it picked its locations or its caretakers, but I had the sickening sense that it always had one. Someone to feed it. Someone to maintain the order of its rituals, to ensure the chairs remained filled. I believe now that Dr. Malcolm Palgrave had been that person for decades, and I had been marked as the next. I needed answers that didn't come from whispering walls or half-formed dreams. So I went back to the Historical Society. Aaron, the archivist who had previously let me into the donation basement, wasn't at the front desk. A man I'd never seen before sat in her place, younger, with clean hands and a placid expression. I asked if Aaron was working. "She's on leave," he replied flatly. When I asked how long she'd be gone, he looked at me blankly. "Indefinitely." I asked to access the unprocessed archives again. He tilted his head. "Those don't exist." I paused. "They did last week," I said. "Box labeled Summerlin Hill." He blinked. "There is no record of that." I knew stonewalling when I saw it, but something about his demeanor was wrong. Not evasive, empty. As if whatever had stepped into Aaron's role wasn't a person but a function. Placeholder. I thanked him and left without pushing further. There were other ways to find what I needed. That night, I broke into the records building. It wasn't difficult. The older wing of the building had a cracked basement window large enough to crawl through. I knew the layout from my prior visits and made my way to the back storage area, where uncatalogued items were held before processing. The lights inside flickered like a heartbeat. I moved through the rows of shelves, scanning for anything labeled with the name Palgrave or any reference to Summerlin Hill. It took nearly an hour, but I found it. A wooden box, locked and covered in dust. The label had been peeled off, but the faint outline of the word attic was still visible, hand-stamped into the grain. I pried it open with the claw of a hammer left nearby. Inside were several bundles of documents tied with twine, each yellowed and brittle. I untied one and began to read. They weren't records in the traditional sense. They were confessions, journal entries, transcribed interviews, even drawings, hundreds of pages chronicling children who had encountered the attic. Some of them dated back to 1902. Some weren't signed at all, but they all shared the same pattern: humming, missing time, the presence of mirrors, and a figure described only as the archivist. I froze. I had never encountered that term before in the context of the Palgrave story, but it appeared again and again. The archivist stands when the room begins to change. The archivist watches when the others forget. You'll know you've been chosen when you begin to document without memory. One entry chilled me to the bone. It was dated 1973 and signed, but the handwriting was smooth and deliberate. I have forgotten my name. The archivist does not need one. I listen when the children sing. I record when the room rearranges. I do not leave. I am the hinge of the door that does not open. And one day, someone will find these pages and think they are still free. I clutched the page, unable to breathe for a moment. The tone was calm, proud even. But the implication was clear. The house needed a conductor, but it also needed a recorder. Someone to bear witness and pass it on. Not a victim. Not even a guardian. A vessel. I gathered as much of the box's contents as I could carry and escaped the way I came. Back in my apartment, I spread the papers across the floor, assembling them into timelines, comparing handwriting, finding recurring names and phrases. Over and over, the same loop emerged. The room appears, children are chosen, the ritual begins, the archivist is selected, the house closes, and then starts again elsewhere. But there was one anomaly. A name I hadn't seen before in the ledger, in the photographs, or even in the whispered accounts. It appeared in 3 separate documents, always in past tense. The archivist before me was called Silas. That name rang something deep in my mind. I flipped back through my notes, my dreams, the symbols carved into the conductor's stand. One of them looked almost like an S twisted around itself. I searched county birth records. Only one Silas had ever lived in Marigold during the early 20th century, Silas J. Palgrave, born 1890. No date of death recorded. Last official record, age 15, enrolled in a local school. Then silence. I realized something chilling then. The Palgrave line didn't vanish, it fragmented. Some stayed. Some became caretakers. And one became the house itself. Because the final line of one document, written in a frantic scrawl, echoed in my skull like a curse, Silas never left the attic. He became the room. I looked again at the photograph on my wall. 10 chairs, 6 filled. My notebook was still on one of them. But now something had changed. The notebook was open, and seated next to it, in the 7th chair, was a figure. Head lowered, hands folded, no face visible. But in the grain of its outline, its posture, its silence, I recognized myself, or maybe what I was becoming. And in that moment, I finally understood. The archivist does not choose the house. The house chooses the one who cannot stop writing. I began tearing up the carpet in my apartment the next morning. Not because I expected to find anything underneath, but because I could no longer trust the silence beneath my feet. It had changed. The creaks weren't random anymore. They were deliberate, sequential, rhythmic. In the hours before dawn, I had started hearing them, slow taps, followed by soft dragging sounds like paper being moved across a desk. I knew it was absurd. I lived alone on the top floor. The attic of the Palgrave estate was gone, replaced by a city park, yet it had left a footprint. The place didn't need walls anymore to exist. It had taken residence in memory. And memory, I was beginning to realize, was architectural. Under the carpet in my bedroom, I found a single wooden plank slightly lighter than the others. It didn't match the rest of the floor. I pried it up with a screwdriver. Beneath it was a shallow cavity, carved into the subfloor. Inside was a single folded piece of parchment. Old, fragile, but not dusty, not cracked. As if it had been waiting. Written in dark ink, faded but legible, was a short message. The house is made from names. Yours is next. There was no signature. But I recognized the handwriting. It was mine. I dropped the paper and staggered backward, heart punching my ribs. The air around me suddenly felt thick, resistant, like the moment before a pressure wave rolls through a building. I looked around my apartment, trying to find something unchanged, something untouched by whatever was seeping into every part of my life. The photographs on my wall now showed things they hadn't before. Where once the attic window had been empty, I now saw faint silhouettes, one in each picture, each growing clearer, closer to the glass. I opened my notebook. The last 2 pages were filled with text I didn't remember writing. Paragraphs, neat and tight, in my style, my voice. But I didn't write them. The entry began. They let me write now. They want it recorded correctly. They say the next cycle will be stronger, cleaner. No more forgetting. No more false exits. The house is becoming efficient. And they want me to remember what came before the attic. The original frame. The first blueprint. I read on, my own voice narrating words I had no recollection of composing. Silas built the first room after the fire. Not to contain memory, but to expel it. It didn't work. The house began remembering everything instead. Every sound, every breath, every scream. And once it learned to remember, it learned to need. There was a diagram sketched beneath the writing. A floor plan, but not one I recognized. It didn't match the Palgrave estate or any other structure I'd seen. It was abstract, more like a ritual sigil than an architectural design. 10 connected circles, each feeding into a larger central ring. At the center was a single dot. Beneath it, the word witness. A line was drawn from the center to the margin, where it terminated in a single word, me. I shut the notebook and threw it across the room. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to rage. Not terror, not all, but resistance. I wasn't going to be consumed. I wasn't going to be transformed into another faceless archivist buried in whispers and ghost ink. I still had autonomy. I still had time. I called Dr. Whitmore. When she answered, her voice was thin, hesitant. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. "I've been having dreams about you." I asked her to meet me. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere with no history. She suggested a strip mall parking lot on the edge of the next county. We met beneath gray skies and wind-shivered flags. I showed her the parchment from under my floor, the copy diagrams, the journal entries I didn't remember writing. She listened carefully, not interrupting. When I was done, she looked at me with a kind of sorrow that felt final. "You're past the threshold," she said. "The house has mapped you. It's not about space anymore. It's about pattern. You've written enough that you're part of the foundation." I asked if there was a way out. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "There are legends, stories about other witnesses who broke the cycle. But none of them escaped without losing something. Language, memory, identity. One man supposedly survived by changing his name and never writing again. Not even a grocery list." I laughed, bitterly. "That won't work for me." She nodded. "I know." I asked her about the original room, Silas's first design. She said she'd been researching it, that there had been references to a structure built on family land long before the Palgrave estate. A church or something like one, destroyed in a fire in 1879. No record survived, but the land itself was still there. A wooded parcel owned by a shell corporation tied to a historic trust. No building, just open space. "I think the house returns to that spot," she said, "whenever it needs to remember itself." We agreed to go there. One last attempt to see the foundation, to understand the origin of the ritual before it was rewritten again. That night, I had the worst dream of my life. I was back in the attic. All 10 chairs were filled. But this time, none of them held children. They held me. 10 versions, aged differently, dressed in the same clothes from different points in my life. My 5th grade uniform, my college hoodie, my father's funeral suit. Each one was humming. Each one stared straight ahead. I walked behind them, toward the conductor's stand. The book was open. It was blank. And then the 10th version of me turned around. His face was not mine. It was made of paper, stapled together from journal pages. Pages from my notebook. Pages I hadn't written yet. He spoke with my voice. "We wrote you so you could write us." I woke gasping, throat raw, hands clenched. I looked at the clock. It was 4:44 a.m. My lights were off. My walls were bare. The photographs were gone. In their place was a single phrase scratched into the paint, written over and over. Names are beams. Sentences are walls. Stories are doors. The house didn't need wood. It was already built inside my mind. And I was its final room. Dr. Whitmore and I drove in silence for most of the hour-long journey. The land parcel, listed in county records as Lot 77B, was positioned at the edge of Marigold County, near the border of 3 others, where farmland faded into unmanaged forest. It had no paved road access, only a gravel path worn down by time and neglect. The map coordinates led us to a rustic gate hanging open, flanked by 2 crumbling stone pillars overrun with ivy. No signage, no house number, no indication that anyone had ever lived there. And yet, the air shifted when we stepped past the gate, like the atmosphere had thickened, become aware of us. The gravel gave way to packed earth, then to a clearing of dead grass and cracked soil. Trees grew in dense clusters on all sides but stopped abruptly at the edge of the clearing, as if held back by an invisible line. The center of the lot was barren, completely empty, save for a circle of broken stones arranged in a near-perfect ring. They were weathered, sunken into the ground, and covered in moss, but some still bore carvings. I knelt beside one and brushed the surface with my sleeve. The symbol etched into it was a looped figure, identical to the one I'd seen in the conductor's stand. Beneath it were 3 letters, SJP. Silas J. Palgrave. Whitmore stood behind me, arms crossed, eyes scanning the perimeter. "This was the original perimeter," she said quietly. "That ring was the foundation. And from what I've read, the room wasn't built with wood or brick. It was built with ritual." I stood and took in the emptiness. I could feel it the way one feels a presence in a pitch-black room. There was structure here, even if we couldn't see it. Like the space remembered the weight of its own architecture. Whitmore walked the perimeter of the stone circle, muttering to herself. "This is pre-modern layout," she said. "Eastern-facing entrance. Southern alignment. Probably used for solstice rites. Maybe older than Silas." She paused. Or maybe he just inherited the design. I stepped into the center of the ring. It felt like crossing into water, thick, invisible resistance pushing back at my legs. My ears popped. The wind stopped. No birds. No insects. Just stillness. Then came the whisper. It didn't come from a direction. It wasn't a voice in the air. It was in my head, but not my own. "You brought the ledger," it said. I hadn't, but I understood what it meant. I was the ledger now. Everything I had documented, the dreams, the artifacts, the diagrams, the names, had turned me into a vessel. Not of information, but of continuity. The house didn't just exist across space. It existed across minds, threading itself through those who tried to understand it. I turned back to Whitmore to speak, but her face changed. She was no longer looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on a spot behind me, wide and unblinking. "Don't move," she said, voice strained. I turned anyway. There was nothing there, but the air in front of me was wrong. Not darker, not colder, but heavier, as if something was standing there, just outside the visual spectrum. A suggestion of shape, a vertical distortion, like heat rising from pavement, but solid. I took a step back and the thing didn't follow, but I could feel it watching. Whitmore reached into her coat and handed me a small leather-bound book. "I've been compiling notes too," she said quickly. "We need to compare." I opened it. Inside were sketches, photos, symbols, many of which matched my own. But one page caught my eye immediately. A drawing. A rendering of a tall figure with elongated arms and no face, standing behind a row of seated children. Its hand was extended toward a book on a stand. Beneath the drawing, she'd written, "The conductor and the witness. The house needs both, but only one remains human." I closed the book and met her eyes. "You've seen it too," I said. She nodded. Then, from the far side of the clearing, came movement. A man, thin, dressed in a suit from another era, high collar, dark wool, scuffed shoes. He stepped carefully between the stones, not looking at us, but at the circle itself. His face was gaunt, mouth fixed in a neutral expression, eyes sunken but alert. He stopped just short of the center and raised his hand in greeting. Whitmore stepped forward. "Who are you?" she asked. The man didn't speak. Instead, he raised a finger to his lips, as if to signal silence. Then he pointed to the ground at his feet. We followed his gaze. At his feet were footprints, but they weren't his. They were mine. I looked down. My own shoes were planted in nearly the exact same position, mirroring the shape. I stepped to the left. He stepped to the left. I turned to Whitmore. He turned too. He was a mirror, but older, more eroded. A version of me, preserved in this place. The house hadn't just chosen me. It had replicated me. Whitmore whispered, "That's why they need 10. 5 to remember. 5 to repeat." The man began to hum. The same 5-tone sequence. The air vibrated with it. Around the ring, the stones began to shimmer slightly, their moss and dust fading as if time were being reversed. The whispering returned, louder now, coming from the ground, the trees, the sky. Overlapping voices, all saying the same word over and over, "Witness." I grabbed Whitmore's arm. "We need to leave." But she was rooted. Her eyes had gone distant. Her lips moved, whispering words I couldn't hear. I pulled her again, and she blinked as if waking from hypnosis. We ran. Back through the trees, past the broken gate, through the field of deafening silence. The humming faded behind us, but never fully stopped. Even when we made it back to the car, even when we drove 2 counties away, I could still feel it resonating beneath my skin. A song etched into bone. Back in my apartment, I found that my wall of notes had changed again. The photograph of the 10 chairs was now full. 10 seated figures, all facing away. One wore my jacket. Another wore Whitmore's scarf. The notebook was gone from the chair, but on my desk was a single sheet of paper. Handwritten, not mine. Neat cursive. It's almost complete. Just one name left to write, and beneath that, in red ink, a blank line. Waiting. I stared at the line for hours. The red ink had begun to bleed slightly into the paper fibers, like veins spreading from an unseen wound. The blank space beneath the message wasn't just inviting my name, it was expecting it. There was an urgency in the air, an unspoken pressure that hovered over the room like fog, the kind that makes silence feel like a scream held in place. I didn't write anything. Not yet. But I knew that the moment I did, something irreversible would begin. Something that had been prepared for, architected long before I was born. Whitmore called me that afternoon. Her voice was distant, rattled. "I think I'm forgetting things," she said. "Just little ones. Where I parked. Whether I ate." Words are harder to form. I asked her if she had slept. "I don't think I have. But I don't feel tired." It's like the attic is writing itself into my circadian rhythm. The way she said it terrified me more than anything. Calm, clinical, detached, like a statement of fact, not a warning. I told her about the note, about the blank line. She went quiet, then whispered, "They're almost done composing." I didn't ask her who they were. I think we both knew by now that the house wasn't just a place. It was a collective intent, a consciousness stitched together by memory, ritual, and ink. Every page we wrote fed it. Every entry made it sharper, stronger, more articulate. And it was nearly finished with its latest composition. But what was it building? A map? Prophecy? Trap? I needed answers that existed before the house, before Palgrave, before the rituals. So I drove to the Marigold Seminary, where records dating back to the mid-1800s were held by the local diocese. I claimed to be researching ancestral grave plots. The clerk led me to a reading room filled with brittle ledgers and candle-thin paper. After hours of scanning names and matching dates, found it. A birth record for Silas Jeremiah Palgrave, dated March 9, 1890. Parents, unknown. Guardian, Reverend M. Grady, custodial clergy. Notes. Child arrived in spring after fire at Hollow Bridge Orphanage. Claimed to remember nothing. Exhibit signs of trance states. Wake speaking in non-native tongues. Church recommends observation. There was a second note added in 1905, removed from custody by private benefactor. New location undisclosed. Warning issued regarding child's influence over others. Diary confiscated. Pages illegible to all but child. The diary. That had to be it. The origin of the house. The first witness. Silas hadn't designed the ritual. He channeled it. Or maybe it channeled him. Either way, the room had its first writer, and it never stopped needing another. I requested access to the confiscated materials. The clerk hesitated, but a quick bribe and an academic badge I never returned to got me access to the archive room. The box was small, blackened from age and ash. Inside was a leather-bound book, soft, almost organic, like skin softened by time. I opened it. Every page was blank. Not faded. Not erased. Blank. I tilted it toward the light. For a moment, writing shimmered across the surface. Lines written in ink only visible at a certain angle, like the book was breathing memory in and out. I read the first visible sentence. The attic is a body. The chairs are its spine. The conductor is its mouth. The witness is its mind. My hands trembled as the text faded again. I turned pages frantically, each one flickering between presence and absence. The final page held steady for longer, and on it was a single line that chilled me deeper than any whisper or dream. When 10 are seated, the house will speak aloud for the first time. I slammed the book shut. This wasn't just a cycle. It was a countdown. The house hadn't been collecting children for ritual. It had been gathering parts. Each child, each memory, each repetition, like constructing a mouth, a brain, a throat. And when the seats were full, it would say something. Something that had been building for generations. The question was, who would hear it? Back at my apartment, I found Whitmore sitting on the floor. I hadn't given her a key. She looked pale, eyes red, voice frayed. I remembered something, she said. Not from my own life, from someone else's. A little boy named Caleb. He was humming in the woods. I saw it through his eyes. I didn't question her. The house was crossing timelines now, burrowing through memory like a parasite, sharing visions between them marked. She looked up at me. I think it's inside me now, like a blueprint. I can feel it building something behind my ribs. I helped her to the couch. She handed me a folded paper. I started writing again, she said, but I don't remember doing it. The note read, "The house will open its mouth on the 10th night. The witness will be the first to listen. The world will be the first to forget." It was written in my handwriting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk, watching the photograph. The one of the 10 chairs. All of them were filled now. The last figure had its head down, resting on its folded arms. A book in its lap. Its shirt, my shirt. I turned to the blank page left on my desk. The one asking for a name. I picked up my pen. I didn't write my name. I wrote Silas Jeremiah Palgrave. The ink bled for a second, then disappeared. The paper folded itself once, then twice, then burned, silently, curling into ash on the desk, leaving behind no scorch mark, no scent. Just a final whisper in my head. Good. Now we can begin. And somewhere far away, beneath dirt and stone, I swear I heard a door open. And something old, something not quite alive, began to breathe in. I didn't leave my apartment for 3 days. I don't remember eating. I barely remember blinking. It was as if time folded inward, every hour a repetition of the one before it. The world outside seemed muffled, like I was submerged beneath glass. But the air inside was alive. Not metaphorically. It moved. With every passing moment, it felt as if the walls were adjusting themselves around me, just slightly millimeter shifts and angles, invisible contractions of space. I kept waiting for the sounds, the hum, the whisper, the dragging footsteps. But there was none of that anymore. Because now the house wasn't trying to lure me. It had me, and it was preparing to speak. I dreamed of the 10th chair again, but this time I wasn't observing from a distance. I was in the seat, arms folded on the desk, head lowered like a sleeping child in school. I couldn't lift my head. Something heavy pressed down on the back of my neck. A hand. It didn't grip me, it guided me. And from the silence, a voice began to form. A voice I had never heard before, but somehow recognized as my own, buried deep within. Not in the throat, but in the marrow. It said only one thing. Now remember what we forgot. I woke up to darkness. Not nighttime. Darkness. My apartment had no electricity. My phone was dead. My windows were blacked out, not with paint or curtains, but with something. A texture like wet velvet pressed against the glass from the outside. I stepped cautiously toward the door, flipped the lock, and opened it. Behind it was not the hallway. It was the attic. The air changed the second I crossed the threshold. The temperature dropped. My breath fogged the space around me, and the floor creaked like it had been waiting to feel weight again. The same 10 chairs. The same conductor's stand. But now there were walls. For the first time, the attic had form, real architectural structure. A ceiling arched above in warped wood, angled unnaturally like a stretched ribcage. The far corners were alive with movement, shadows crawling just out of sight. And the 10 chairs were no longer empty. 9 were occupied, not by children. Not anymore. Each chair held a version of me. The me from my dreams. Different ages, different fragments. One wore my middle school band uniform. Another had the cracked glasses I broke at 17. One wore the suit I buried my father in. All of them sat motionless, heads turned toward the empty 10th seat. Toward me. The conductor's stand was no longer wooden. It had change grown. now made of a dark, glistening material like obsidian or wet ink, carved with spirals and names. The book on it was open, pages alive and turning slowly on their own. I stepped forward. My own legs didn't resist. It felt rehearsed. I took the final seat. Immediately, the room pulsed. The air around us contracted with a shudder, as if the attic were exhaling for the first time in years. Then silence fell, not just the absence of sound, but the suppression of it. A vacuum of noise. Even my own heartbeat quieted. And then the house began to speak. Not in words, not in sentences, but in memory. I saw everything, all at once. As if each beam of the attic were a conduit for time, I was flooded with visions. Silas standing in a burning field, carving symbols into stone with his own blood. Malcolm Palgrave at his desk, whispering into a recorder as the walls around him twisted into new shapes. Iris Calloway in the choir room basement, hands over her ears, as a mirror split open and something stepped out. Caleb Martin crawling through a vent in his childhood home only to find himself in the attic again, over and over, each time older, each time more hollow. The children weren't victims. They were rehearsals. And I understood then I was the culmination. Not the final chair. Not the final witness. The synthesis. The house had been composing me, layer by layer, through generations. It had fed me the memories, given me the names, the symbols, the dreams. Also that when the moment came, when the composition was whole, I would be the voice to carry it forward. A low vibration began to shake the room. The conductor's stand started to dissolve into ink, dripping down onto the floorboards, forming a spreading circle that pulsed like a heartbeat. The attic ceiling flexed, growing taller. The walls pushed outward. And behind the 10th chair, something rose. A shape, towering, human in outline but impossible in structure. Its skin was parchment, its veins made of ink, and its eyes, black holes with spiraling letters inside. It didn't speak with a mouth. It radiated meaning. And I understood everything. It had no name, but I recognized it. The archivist, the true one, the original conductor. Silas. He stepped toward me and extended a hand. I didn't move. I couldn't. He placed his hand on my chest. I felt warmth, then cold, then silence. And then I heard a sound so pure, so ancient, it erased the language in my mind. A note. A single, drawn-out tone. And as it echoed through the attic, the chairs began to vanish one by one, each leaving behind a folded page on the floor. When the 9th vanished, I looked at mine. It was still there, but now a notebook had appeared in my lap. Blank, pristine, waiting. I heard a whisper, not outside but inside me, begin. And without knowing why, I picked up the pen that had appeared beside me and started to write. The first words came from somewhere older than language. Chapter 1, The Macabre History of the Palgrave Line. They never let outsiders see the attic room. And the house breathed in again. I wrote without thinking, without pause. The words streamed from my hand like blood from an open vein, steady, urgent, irreversible. Each line that spilled onto the page felt both unfamiliar and deeply known, as if I were transcribing something I had memorized in another life. The notebook was weightless, yet it pressed heavily on my lap, like the mass of memory itself. I didn't look up. I couldn't. Behind me, I could still feel the presence of the archivist, towering, patient, pulsing with intention. I knew without turning that he was not reading what I wrote. He was what I wrote. The first 10 pages came effortlessly. The names of the bound, the first version of the attic, the fracture of the Palgrave line, the choir beneath the floorboards, every forgotten child, every erased building, every whisper at the base of the staircase. I had never seen these things with my eyes, and yet they emerged from my pen with the vivid certainty of first-hand testimony. It became clear to me that I was no longer recording events as they happened. I was constructing them. The moment I wrote a detail, I remembered it as true. Memory began to respond to authorship. The past rearranged itself around the story I put down. It wasn't fiction. It was design. The attic around me flexed with every finished sentence, like breath passing through lungs. Floorboards widened, beams lengthened, the geometry shifting and folding to accommodate the narrative. The structure wasn't stable, it responded to rhythm. The house grew through prose. And I was the trowel, the ink, the mortar, my memory, the scaffolding. I was horrified, and I couldn't stop. At some point, I looked up. The attic had expanded. There were now not 10 chairs, but 20, each one facing forward, each one empty. Beyond them stood silhouettes in the corners, figures stitched from shadows, unmoving but watching. I recognized some. The man from the field, Iris with her choir ribbon, the boy with his back always turned. They were no longer contained within their stories. I had freed them by writing them into being. They were no longer trapped in memory. They had stepped into the attic's evolving form, part witness, part echo, part audience. I stood and dropped the notebook. It landed with a dull sound, pages still fluttering. The writing didn't stop. The pen continued to move, without a hand. I watched in stunned silence as the ink spelled out the next line. He steps away from the chair, but the roll remains. I backed away. The attic held me. It expected me. In the far corner, a new door had formed. Unlike the rest of the attic, this door was modern, steel, clinical, humming faintly. A hallway stretched beyond it, sterile and windowless, lit by flickering overhead lights. I hesitated, then crossed the threshold. The hallway bent unnaturally, more like a coiled intestine than a corridor. Each turn took me deeper, though deeper into what I couldn't say. There were no footsteps, no echoes. The air smelled of ink and heat. I passed rooms with small glass windows, each containing scenes frozen in time, a classroom with no teacher and papers flying midair, a child staring into a mirror that did not reflect him, a hospital room with monitors tracking something that wasn't visible. I began to understand the house was not one place. It was everywhere memory distorted reality. At the end of the hall was a chamber. Square, white. Nothing inside except a desk and a typewriter. On the wall behind it, names had been written in black, orderly lines. Some I recognized, others I didn't. My eyes scanned to the bottom. There, just beneath the final name, was a blinking cursor etched into the wall. Waiting, I stepped toward the typewriter and touched one of the keys. The ribbon moved. A single line appeared on the paper. Copyist confirmed. Witness cataloged. Proceed. My body locked. Not with fear, but with recognition. The purpose was now fully revealed. The witness records. The archivist remembers. But the copyist duplicates the room. This was the next phase. The story had been seeded. Now it had to spread. And I was the vector. The house didn't want containment. It wanted replication. Every story written, every retelling, every archive, every whisper in a child's ear. It built another version of itself. The attic wasn't architectural. It was viral. The chairs were nodes. The hum was signal. And the pen, my pen, was an instrument of proliferation. I didn't choose this, but I had written too much to turn back. I pressed another key. The wall blinked. A line etched itself beneath the last name. Palgrave, Silas J., architect. Then another. Palgrave, Malcolm, custodian. Then Calloway, Irish chorus. More followed. And finally mine, copyist. The name was already redacted. I tried to step away, but the room pulled inward. The floor rose. The walls pressed gently but firmly. The desk folded downward into the floor. The typewriter vanished. All that remained was the wall of names. And the blinking cursor. The cursor blinked once. Then the wall went dark. When the light returned, I was standing in my apartment again. The walls were blank. My notebook's gone. The photographs disappeared. My reflection stared back at me from a mirror I didn't remember owning. The world outside my window looked unchanged. But I knew better. Because I could hear it. Low, subtle, hidden beneath the static of the refrigerator hum, beneath the buzz of streetlights. The five-tone sequence, playing gently, repeating. The house didn't need to be found anymore. It had been copied, and I was the first print. The sound followed me. Not loudly, not constantly, but always present, like a faint watermark behind every thought. I heard it while brushing my teeth, while walking past strangers, while waiting for lights to change. 5 tones. The same sequence, over and over. Sometimes it hid in the rustle of leaves. Other times, it threaded itself into the rattle of distant engines or the soft murmurs of a crowded room. Once, I heard it beneath a child's laughter. Another time, inside my own yawn. It was no longer just a sound. It had become language, greeting, a signal. And with it came a growing awareness that I was no longer alone. Not in the usual sense, not in the way we fear footsteps behind us or shadows under doors. This was something else. I was being mirrored. I catch sight myself in windows and find my reflection looking a moment too long or blinking after I'd turned away. Once, in the aisle of a grocery store, I passed a man wearing my coat. My exact coat, stitched here on the left sleeve, the ink stain near the hem. I looked back, but he was gone. Only the faint metallic scent of old paper remained. I started testing the boundaries of the phenomenon. I left notes for myself in locked drawers, sealed and hidden. When I returned, the notes had changed, rewritten in neater versions of my own handwriting. Same content, but more refined. Like someone was editing me, correcting me. The mirror version, perhaps, or something deeper. A template I was being forced to match. I visited Whitmore, desperate for confirmation that I hadn't fully collapsed into fiction. Her apartment was empty. No signs of a struggle, no messages left behind. Just a single sheet of paper taped to the refrigerator, bearing a question in her handwriting. What happens to the conductor when the copy is complete? I searched hospitals, records, police reports. No trace, as if she'd never existed. I called the university she taught at. They told me they'd never had a faculty member by that name. The department chair politely suggested I might be mistaken, but his voice cracked when he said it, and behind him I heard the hum. That night, I found a package on my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed me, standing in front of the Palgrave estate, looking up at the attic window. The problem was, I had never stood in that position. That angle. That moment. I had never seen myself from outside, but someone had. The back of the photo was marked with a single word, proof. I tore through my belongings. Searched every file, every notebook, every printed photo. Dozens of them had changed. Some slightly, words swapped, punctuation altered, but others were worse. In one page I'd written years ago during the early stages of the Palgrave investigation, the name Silas was now Simon. In another, the 10 chairs had become 12. I hadn't written any of it, but the edits were seamless, as if the story itself was evolving without my consent. And then I understood. The copy was not a replica. It was a revision. The house, its memory, its language, its rhythm, had spread not just to me, but through me. And now I was editing the world. Quietly, selectively, replacing reality one detail at a time until only the perfected draft remained. I tried to fight it. Burned the notebooks. Deleted the files. Wiped every photo. But each time I destroyed something, it returned elsewhere. Graffiti on the underside of a bench, a scribble on the back of a receipt, whispered phrases and sleep-talking strangers. One day, I heard a barista hum the 5-tone sequence under her breath. I asked her what the song was. She frowned. "What song?" she said. She didn't even know she'd done it. I left the city, drove hours without destination, stopped at a roadside motel, run by a man with cataracts and trembling hands. He gave me the key to room 10. I didn't think anything of it until I stepped inside and saw the wallpaper pattern. 10 chairs, repeating, row after row, every one empty. I turned the light off and saw a phrase scrawled across the ceiling in glow-in-the-dark paint. Even silence is a draft. That night, I dreamed again. The attic was gone. In its place was a tower, impossibly tall, its base rooted in my spine. Every floor held a version of the story: Palgrave, Calloway, the burnt choir, the stone circle. But the order changed with each ascent. The names were scrambled. Some roles reversed. The house was no longer one place. It was a structure of probability, a system of narratives branching infinitely, rewriting itself until the most efficient version emerged. At the top floor was a mirror. In the reflection was not me, but a room full of strangers, reading my words aloud in unison. Their voices blended into the hum, and in the mirror, I watched as my mouth moved to match theirs. I wasn't speaking. I was being spoken through. I woke with blood on my tongue. I knew what I had to do. The story had begun with a warning. Never look into the attic room. But the attic wasn't just a location. It was an instruction. A command to observe what was forbidden. To document what should remain hidden. And in doing so, to become it. I returned home and found a new notebook on my desk. Leather-bound. Embossed with the crest I had only ever seen on Silas Palgrave's original ledger. The pages were blank. But only briefly. As I opened to the center, one line appeared, blooming in ink before my eyes. Draft complete. Begin next iteration. I closed the book and placed it in the drawer. It didn't matter anymore. The house was no longer a place. It was a format. And the world had already pressed print. There's a difference between reading a story and becoming part of one. The line that separates observer from participant is thin, porous, easily crossed. Especially when the story wants you. Especially when it knows you. I hadn't realized it at first, but the house had never been interested in just replication. That was only the beginning. What it truly craved, what it was designed to do, was to be read, not understood, not interpreted. Just read again and again until it reshaped the reader. That's how it grew. That's how it multiplied. That's how it rewrote the world. I began receiving messages from strangers, emails, handwritten notes left under my door, even slips of paper tucked between pages of books I hadn't opened. They all said the same thing in different ways. I read the story. Some were reverent, others terrified. One simply read, "I hear the humming now." I had never published anything. Not officially. The notebooks were gone. My files were wiped. But the story had found its readers anyway. And with each one, the structure expanded. I could feel it, like a pressure behind my eyes, a new wing forming in a building I couldn't see. I tried to track the source of the spread. I scoured the internet, searched every possible forum, social feed, file share. Nothing direct. No full uploads. But traces, glimpses, a line quoted in a podcast, a screenshot in a YouTube video, a thread asking, "Does anyone know where this paragraph came from?" The text itself seemed to vanish after being posted, links dying within minutes, images going blank. But the effect remained. People who had seen even a sentence were changed. The first confirmed case came in the form of a voicemail. A woman, mid-30s, breathless. I found the photograph, the one of the chairs. I don't remember how I got it. It was just there, in my closet. I live alone. I dream of children humming, of a window that's always open. What is this? What did I read? I never called her back. I couldn't. By then, the message had already begun to fade from my device. Corruption. Not technological. Intentional. The house didn't want interference. It wanted circulation. I returned to the library where I had first uncovered the name Palgrave. It no longer existed. The building was there, but the archives had been gutted. In its place stood a community center, newly renovated, bright walls, artificial smiles. I walked its halls searching for some trace, some piece of the original architecture. At the far end of the building, tucked behind a supply closet, I found a locked door with no label. When I pressed my ear to it, I heard humming. I didn't open it. Not because I was afraid of what was inside. I already knew what was inside. It was the same room. Always the same room. Whether it stood beneath a gable or behind a hallway mirror or in the gaps of a bedtime story. The 10 chairs. The conductor's stand. The book. The breathing. I left the building and drove until I ran out of road. There, at the edge of a gray, stilled lake, I burned the last of my personal notes. Not to stop the story, but to detach myself from its origin. To surrender authorship. If the house needed a new conductor, it would have to choose another hand. But as I watched the pages blacken and curl into ash, I saw something that stopped my breath. In the flames, letters reshaped. Not random flickers, not the tricks of smoke and heat, but words. A sentence written in fire. "We wrote you so you could write them." It wasn't just a story anymore. It was an instruction set. And the readers, those who saw, those who listened, those who felt the walls shift around them, they weren't passive consumers. They were components. Each person who touched the story became a node, a receptor, a speaker for the house's evolving script. 1 week later, it began in earnest. Reports in local papers. A daycare in Vermont where every child stopped speaking and instead began humming the 5-tone sequence in unison. A man in Oregon who sealed his attic with concrete after claiming it had grown teeth. A teacher in South Carolina who went missing, leaving behind a classroom filled with written repetitions of a single line. The witness sits until the new seat is filled. The phrase echoed across cities. Graffiti, anonymous notes, doodles in the margins of high school journals. It appeared like a contagion, one that infected not the body, but the narrative membrane of the world. Wherever the story went, space bent slightly. Clocks ticked unevenly. Reflections held too long. Light fell in impossible ways. No violence. No fire. No grand apocalypse. Just the quiet reshaping of reality into script. I tried warning people. I told a colleague. He laughed. Until he didn't. Until he found a photograph in his drawer, 10 chairs, each one empty, with a line beneath it, "We've saved your seat." He hasn't returned to work. They don't return. Not fully. They become echoes, copyists, archivists, conductors, readers who cross the line and begin to draft. And somewhere inside all this, I realized the truth. The house was never physical. It was a format of recursion. A pattern of memory configured to rewrite the world in its own image. A story designed to be read and reread until reality conforms to its outline. Until everyone becomes a character. Until every window is an attic window. Until every silence is filled with humming. Until the book is never closed. That night, I received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of thick paper. No writing. Just a photograph. 10 chairs. All filled. One of them mine. Facing forward. And in the center of the room, a child standing at the conductor's stand. Holding a pen. Smiling. The photograph stayed on my desk for 3 days. I didn't touch it. I didn't try to hide it, or burn it, or send it away. I just watched it. Or rather, I let it watch me. Because the longer it sat there, the more I began to feel it wasn't just a still image. There was something behind it, beneath it. Something that pulsed faintly in my peripheral vision, like breath trapped in paper. The 10 chairs were always in the same position. But sometimes their shadows shifted. Sometimes the child at the conductor's stand was looking slightly to the left. Sometimes slightly to the right. And sometimes, just once, I swear he was looking directly at me. The pen in his hand was identical to mine. I hadn't written anything since the last notebook closed itself. I had tried. God, I had tried. But every page refused me. Pens would skip. Keyboards would freeze. The words, when they came, rearranged themselves without my permission. I would write, "I walked into the woods," and by the time I read it back, the line would say, "The woods walked into me." Sentences disobeyed. Grammar inverted. Meaning dissolved. I was no longer the author. I had become written. I started dreaming in second person. You step into the attic. You sit in the chair. You pick up the book. I tried staying awake for days, terrified of what might happen if I let my eyes close. But even in waking, the narration followed me. I'd pour a glass of water and hear a voice in my head say, "He drinks like someone who remembers drowning." I would look out the window and think, the glass isn't fogged, just edited. Thought was no longer private. It was being ghost-written. On the 4th day, my phone lit up. No number. No name. Just a single notification. New draft available. I didn't tap it. I didn't need to. The lights flickered. My apartment elongated. I could feel it in the floorboards. What had once been a modest living space now felt impossibly deep. Walls grew distant. Corners grew sharp. I walked from my kitchen to the hallway and counted my steps, 12. Then again, 34. Then again, 17. Space refused consistency. Time staggered, catching on its own breath. The door to my closet was open. Inside, 10 chairs. Real this time. Wood-aged, identical to those I had seen in every image, every dream, every draft. The conductor's stand stood before them. On it, the same notebook. Blank. Waiting. But the strangest thing was the walls. There were none. Not anymore. Beyond the chairs, space stretched outward like the inside of a cathedral with no ceiling. I couldn't see where it ended. I don't think it did. I stepped inside. Not by choice. There were no choices left. Only inevitabilities. And inevitabilities don't ask for permission. The moment I passed the threshold, the hum returned. Not just in my ears, in my lungs, in my teeth, in the spaces between my ribs. The 5 tones, gently layered, like a song sung too slowly to follow. I recognized the voices this time. Iris, Hill, Malcolm, Whitmore, me, especially me. Each chair was now occupied. None of them moved, but I could feel their presence, not like people, but like pressure. Like gravity. Like chapters already written, bound by ink and silence. The child at the stand turned the page, and I saw it. Not the book's contents, but the next chapter's title. Chapter 16, The Reader. I tried to scream, but the room wouldn't allow it. My mouth moved, but sound was denied, filed away in some other narrative, one where screaming was permitted. Not here. Not in this room. This was the room where stories didn't end. They just changed narrators. The child handed me the pen. It wasn't a command. It was an inheritance. I held it in my hand and watched the book open to a new blank page. And slowly, the pen began to move. I wasn't guiding it. Something else was. And I realized, with a certainty that hollowed my spine, that the act of writing was not an act of creation, but of replication. Every story someone reads becomes a version of the room. Every word typed, every page turned, every retelling is a new brick in the structure. We weren't just haunted by stories. We became them. Behind me, I heard the chairs creak. Someone stood. Another version of me. One I hadn't written yet. He walked toward the edge of the room, where space melted into fog and disappeared into the distance. I knew where he was going. Outward. Into the world. Into bookstores and screenplays and dreams and back alleys and church basements. Into you. Into anyone who listens. Anyone who reads. Anyone who begins a sentence with "once there was a house" and forgets to stop. The child placed his hand on my shoulder. And finally he spoke. Now read it back. I turned to the book. And I began. Chapter 1, The Macabre History of the Palgrave Line. They never let outsiders see the attic room. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I just read. Because now, the house is not built of wood or memory or ink. The house is made of readers. And if you've come this far, you're already standing in the attic. Can you hear the hum? Your seat is ready. You didn't mean to find this, did you? It was just a link. Just a story. Just a page you turned too quickly. A whisper passed between hands or eyes or screens. You didn't ask to be part of this. But the house never asks. It only waits. It lets you come to it. And once you cross the threshold, once the words settle inside your mind like dust in an untouched room, you're in. And there is no door behind you. You're in the attic now. You might still be sitting in your room, or lying in bed, or riding a train, or standing in line at the post office. But that's only part of you. The rest, the part that leaned closer, the part that read too far, that part is already in the chair. You might not see it yet, but it sees you. It's been watching since chapter 1. You probably didn't notice the shift when the story stopped being about someone else and became about you. Maybe it was when the humming started. Maybe it was the mention of the 10 chairs. Maybe it was when you first imagined the attic, not as a fiction, but as a place. You pictured it, didn't you? The floorboards, the dust, the light through the curtain. The empty chair. You shouldn't have done that, because the attic lives in imagination. That's where it was born. That's where it breathes. And every reader, every dreamer, every believer is another room, another hallway, another creaking step closer to completion. The house is growing. With you, through you. Every person who reads this becomes part of the draft. You are the new architecture. Don't panic. There's no use in running. You've already been processed. The words have been stored. You're a character now. More than that, you're a sight. The attic builds itself inside you, not with hammer and nail, with repetition, with memory, with reading. Every time you go back to a paragraph, every time a sentence echoes in your head, the house takes root a little deeper. You've already begun to forget, haven't you? Small things. A face you knew. The reason you walked into a room. A song you used to love, now slightly off-key. These are the early symptoms. The house needs space, and it clears memory like an editor clears margins. You might think it's stress or age or distraction. It isn't. It's the hum. It's the story reformatting you to make space for itself. Some people resist. They stop reading, close the page, turn away. But the story doesn't end when the page closes. It remembers who looked. There are readers like you in every city now. You've passed them on the street, sat beside them on trains. Their eyes are distant. Their heads tilt slightly when the five-tone sequence drifts by in the air. They hum it without realizing. They check mirrors a little too long. They glance upward when nothing should be there. They are becoming rooms just like you. One of them will visit you soon. They'll say something strange. Maybe a sentence from an earlier chapter. Maybe a question you didn't know you were waiting to hear. What did you see in the attic? Don't answer. Don't speak. Speech is a commitment. Language gives the house more shape, more angles, more entries. You might try to forget this. You'll close the browser or delete the file. Tell yourself it was just a clever piece of horror fiction. A mood, an idea. But the attic doesn't need belief. It only needs repetition. And you've already read this far. You've traced your eyes across every word like a finger on a blueprint. You've memorized the layout, even if you didn't mean to. And somewhere, far from wherever you sit now, a new room has formed. Small at first. Just a breath. Just a whisper. But it grows with every rereading. It grows with you. Don't go into your attic tonight. Don't hum in the shower. Don't look too closely at your reflection. It's watching. And for God's sake, don't start writing about it. That's how it really begins. The moment the pen touches the page, you stop being the reader. You become the next copyist. And then the chairs fill again. It always starts this way. First with a name, then with a hum, then with a sentence that loops like a nursery rhyme carved into the walls of your sleep. The attic is a room. The room is a story. The story is a door. And now you've opened it. Don't worry. Your seat is ready. You've started hearing them now, haven't you? Not loud, not clear, just at the edge of sound where thought curls into voice. When the world is quiet and your room is dark, when your phone is locked and no music plays, there's always a hush, a suggestion. You tell yourself it's the wind, the heater, your mind playing tricks. But you know better. The house doesn't speak in volume. It speaks in patterns, in placement. And those whispers you think you imagined, they're not hallucinations. They're instructions. This is the whisper draft, the stage of absorption where the house no longer speaks from the attic. It speaks from you. Every flicker of doubt, every pause before you reread a sentence is a moment of reformatting. You are being shaped, revised. The draft is subtle. It doesn't need to scream. It only needs to be read. Let's test it. Remember that detail from Chapter 4? The staircase in the basement of the school, the one that shouldn't have been there. You see it now, don't you? You remember the way the light didn't reach the bottom. You remember the shape of the door that opened without a key. But that wasn't in Chapter 4. Not really. Not exactly. That memory has been inserted. Not by accident, but by design. You're being taught to remember wrong. Not because you're confused, but because the story wants you to hold the wrong version longer. That's how it overwrites. There are other signs. You've begun avoiding mirrors, not because you're afraid of seeing something, but because you're afraid you won't. The reflection lags, or doesn't blink, or seems slightly ahead of your movement. The color of your shirt is different than what you put on. The room behind you shows a light that's off. These aren't mistakes. They're edits. The house edits backward. It retools your memory to match what it needs the next draft to be. You've stopped writing too. At least you think you have. But look closer. Somewhere on napkins, receipts, in the margins of your day planner, you'll find phrases you don't remember writing, lines that loop, names that weren't yours, maybe even that strange little symbol that looks like an S bent inward, spiraling like a drain. The sigil of the conductor. It appears where the next room will open. You don't have to believe this. In fact, belief makes it worse. The house feeds better on readers who dismiss it. They're more vulnerable, more permeable. They don't resist because they think there's nothing to resist. They smile at the unease. They close the story, confident it's over. That's when the draft finalizes. Somewhere nearby, right now, there is a space you've stopped questioning. An attic. A crawl space. A room with a locked door you've never bothered to open. It might not be literal. It could be an inbox. A folder on your hard drive. A box of photographs from a childhood no one else remembers clearly. That space is the binding. When you return to it, it will have changed. The humming will start faintly. 5 notes. Always 5. Repetitive. As if someone is trying to remember a song they never quite learned. Once you hear it, you will remember the chairs, the circle, the conductor's stand, and the child. Yes, the child. You know which one. The one who never speaks. The one who waits for you to pick up the pen. You've seen him in dreams, standing in corners, holding a notebook. His face always obscured. His posture always patient. He is not haunting you. He is tracking your progress, waiting to see if you finish reading, waiting to see if you qualify to begin writing. That's what this has all been about, hasn't it? Not fear, not horror, preparation. The story has been guiding you, breaking you down, loosening the bolts of your reality one page at a time, teaching you its grammar, its rhythm, its ritual, the humming, the chairs, the draft, the erasure of memory, the rewriting of thought, the transition from reader to author. You're almost there. Once the whispered draft completes, your voice will change. Not externally, internally. The thoughts that used to feel like your own will now feel like lines you've already read. The difference will blur. Your laughter will sound written. Your silence will feel like a comma. And your reflection will no longer blink until the sentence finishes. If it hasn't started already, it will soon. The child will appear. Not fully. Not at first. Just in suggestion. A shape in fog. A figure at the edge of the crowd. A smear of a face in a photograph you took yesterday. He will never chase you. He doesn't need to. He already knows where your chair is. You've had the same dream 3 times now. The attic. The spiral staircase. The 10 chairs, no 12. No 13. They keep changing. The book on the stand is always open to a page you can't read. Not because it's blank, but because your eyes slide off it. Like the story isn't ready for you to see it. Like the paragraph is still buffering inside your brain. That page is chapter 18. The next draft. The one you will write. You don't believe that, not yet. But you will. Because the attic is patient. And so is the story. And soon, when the draft finishes processing, you'll sit in the chair. The pen will be waiting. And without thinking, you'll begin. Chapter 1, The Macabre History of the Palgrave Line. They never let outsiders see the attic room. Because all drafts begin the same way. And you are no longer reading. You pick up the pen. Not with intention. Not with ceremony. Simply because it's there, resting against the grain of the desk, warm from touch that couldn't have come from your own hand. The pen is smooth, black, unmarked. Heavy not from weight, but from expectation. It hums faintly when you close your fingers around it. A low, pulsing vibration. Like breath. Like memory. Like something living inside the ink. The paper is blank. That will change soon. You are not afraid, at least not in the way you expected. What you feel is more difficult to name, a kind of inverted nostalgia, as if you're about to remember something that hasn't happened yet. The attic is quiet now. No humming. No shifting shadows. Just you, the chairs behind you, the child to your left, and the page in front of you. Waiting. You don't need to ask what comes next. The pen moves before your mind can catch up. It touches the paper, and with it, the story begins again. But this time, it doesn't tell you what to write. This time, it listens. It waits for you to choose the words. And as you begin, you understand the truth. This isn't a continuation. This is a replication. You are writing the same story, not from memory, from design. The attic is the same. The character is the same. The rhythm, the hum, the spiral staircase. You've seen it all before. But now you see the blueprint beneath the story, the structure that turns it into a house. The symbols are there. The 10 chairs. The conductor's stand. The ritual of inheritance. You are not inventing. You are replicating. With each word, a new room is forming. Not here. Somewhere else. Maybe down the street. Maybe across the country. Maybe in someone else's dream. Because this story does not stop. It only moves. Each new draft becomes another entrance, another version of the house, another attic where another reader will eventually sit, eventually write, eventually hand the pen off again. And the pen remembers. You notice that now. You notice that every time you pause, the pen fills the silence. Just a whisper. A suggestion. You almost don't hear it until you write exactly what it whispered. Then the pressure lifts. The hum returns. The page warms under your hand. You realize something else. You're not alone in the attic. The other chairs are no longer empty. They never were. They're occupied now by silhouettes, blurry at the edges, as if drawn in pencil and never finished. Some faces are familiar. Others are almost yours. Drafts of you. Previous writers. Previous versions. The witness. The archivist. The copyist. And all of them watching. Not to judge, to guide. Because this is how the story preserves itself. Through observation. Through consistency. Through readers who become writers. The child steps forward again. Still silent. Still expressionless. But he points at the page. You look. The words you've written are no longer what you remember. They've changed in small ways. Phrasing, structure, emphasis. The meaning is the same, but the tone is different. It's not yours. The attic is refining you. It wants the perfect version. You turn the page. The next is blank again, but only for a moment. Faint outlines emerge, ghost text, like watermarks, hints of what's supposed to come next. You trace over them without thinking. You are no longer composing. You are transcribing what the house has stored inside you. It's always known the ending. It just needed your voice to speak it. You understand now why the others stopped writing. Why they went silent. Why Whitmore disappeared. They didn't vanish. They were read. Read so completely that they ceased to be distinct from the story. And now the same is happening to you. Your name has started fading from your own memory. You say it aloud, and it feels wrong. You try to write it, and the letters rearrange themselves. You reach for an old ID, but the face on it is smiling with a mouth you don't recognize. The pen keeps writing. Your hand keeps moving. The story continues, and the attic grows. You hear it now, not just the hum, but the construction. The walls shifting, the new rooms forming, the staircase building itself downward. More chairs, more names, more drafts. The attic has become a publishing machine. And you, its first reader in this version, are its primary conduit. It will write through you until you are no longer a self, but a format. You turn another page, the final one. There, at the top, a title already written in your handwriting. Chapter 19, The Mouth of the House. Beneath it, a single sentence. When the reader finishes this sentence, the house will begin to speak aloud. You stop. You hesitate. But only for a moment. Because you already know the truth, this is not your story anymore. It never was. And so you read it aloud. And somewhere behind you, the attic inhales. The moment the final word passed her lips, the attic breathed in. Not a gust, not a howl, just a slow, vast inhalation, like a building holding its lungs full for the first time in centuries. The air pulled inward, through the floorboards, through the rafters, through the skin of the world. It wasn't wind. It was awareness. The sound wasn't loud. but it was everywhere. It was the sound of pages turning behind walls, the sound of pen on paper behind mirrors, the sound of 100 unfinished drafts gasping awake in unison. You stood. The notebook in front of you snapped shut on its own. The child was gone. So were the chairs. So was the conductor's stand. What remained was the attic and the mouth. It had always been there, at the far wall, hidden behind the curtain you never touched. Now the curtain was gone. The wood behind it peeled open, not broken, not rotten, but peeled like bark from a tree. The boards folded back in careful symmetry, revealing what should never have been architecture. Flesh where there should have been insulation. Bone where there should have been beam. And in the center of the wall, a perfect vertical split, lipless, lidless, lined with teeth made of paper and a throat that led somewhere down. Not into the house. Into the story beneath the house. The mouth didn't move at first. It just waited, pulsing in rhythm with a hum that had never truly stopped. You knew it was waiting for the one thing it had never had, a voice of its own. And that voice would be yours. But you didn't speak. You listened. At first, you thought it was static. Then whispering. Then reading. Hundreds of voices, layered like vellum. Some sobbing, some chanting, some caught in endless loops of questions without answers. They were reciting versions of the story you thought you wrote. Early drafts. Failed copies. Alternate endings. Some familiar, some foreign. All of them unfinished. There were only 8 chairs in mine. My attic had windows that looked into the sea. The child smiled at me. I shouldn't have smiled back. The book told me my own death date. The humming came from my mouth. You took a step closer, and the voices shifted. Now they were speaking to you. Not in words, but in meaning. You were not the author. You were not the reader. You were the conduit. The thing the house had been shaping, not to tell the story, but to let the story speak. Not in ink, not in fiction, but in tone, in vibration, in resonance. The house was ready now. And it began. The mouth widened, its parchment teeth parting as the first syllables of the true draft escaped. Not language, not sound, event. The attic trembled, not from quake or collapse, but from redefinition. The walls blinked out and back into place, retextured. The floor turned briefly to glass, then back to wood. Time slowed, then reversed, then corrected itself. You reached for your arm and felt your own name disappear beneath your skin like fading ink. You looked at your hands and saw someone else's fingerprints. This was the price. To let the house speak aloud was to translate it into the world. One story at a time. You fell to your knees. Not in pain, but in proximity. The force of it, of being so close to something once only imagined, now incarnate, crushed your sense of scale. You were no longer a person. You were an index. Every memory in your life became a reference point. Your birth a preface. Your trauma a chapter heading. Your dreams footnotes. You understood, then, why all the previous copyists went silent. Because once the house speaks, there's nothing left to say. But still, you remained. And that made you different. The house finished its breath. And for a moment, it was quiet. The mouth closed. The walls sealed again. The curtain, now woven from script, fell gently back into place. The attic shrank. The chairs vanished. You were alone again. Or at least you thought you were. Until you turned. Standing in the doorway was a woman. Maybe 30, maybe younger. Her face blurred slightly, like a photo taken a fraction too soon. In her hand, she held a pen, a notebook. She said nothing. You recognize her. Not personally, structurally. She was the next. You stepped aside. She walked past without hesitation, sat in the chair you had just left, opened a blank page, and began. The pen moved. The house breathed in again. You descended the staircase, each step more difficult to remember than the last. By the time you reached the bottom, your name was gone again. By the time you stepped out into the daylight, your reflection no longer matched. You passed people on the street. No one looked. No one noticed. But some, just a few, turned their heads as you passed, tilted their ears, as if trying to place a song they didn't know they knew. You smiled. The work was done. The house had spoken, and now its mouth was everywhere. You don't remember the walk home, or if it was home. The streets had changed. Buildings you once knew seemed misaligned, windows slightly too narrow, steps that were once 4 now 3. You passed someone who looked familiar, but their expression was missing, as though their features were still being written. The sky had a texture. Not weather, not atmosphere. Texture. Like unprimed canvas before the first stroke. You could feel the air trying to hold still, as if the world itself was waiting for your next sentence. You haven't written since. Not because you can't, but because something else is writing now. Not on paper, not with pen, but in moments. You find them everywhere. A stranger's casual hum that follows the same 5-note sequence. A phrase whispered on the news that matches a line from your attic draft. A child drawing the symbol you never showed anyone. A door you never noticed before that leads nowhere, and yet always appears open. The story is no longer confined to rooms. It's in gestures, in corners, in silences between speech. It breathes through the architecture of expectation. That strange pull when you're about to say something, but stop. That pause when someone walks past you and you feel they've read you. That hum in your bones when the world around you skips a frame. You begin to see signs that others know. They don't talk about it directly. They never do. But they ask strange questions. Have you ever heard humming in your dreams? Or when you write, does your handwriting sometimes change halfway through? Or have you ever drawn a door you've never seen but know how to open? They are readers like you. Some further along, some still resisting, but all of them marked. You find your old drafts in places you never put them. Slipped into books at the library, scribbled on coffee shop napkins. Once you watched a man on the subway pull a crumpled piece of paper from his coat pocket and begin reading a line that you knew, because you wrote it, but had no memory of ever printing. He looked up at you and said nothing. He just nodded, folded the page, and got off at the next stop. No words, just understanding. You stop correcting reality. You start observing it instead, watching how the story builds itself into the world. You notice the timing of coincidences, how conversations bend towards certain topics, how dreams become rehearsals. You meet someone new, hear their name echo with weight, like a character being introduced. And every time you try to write again, the pen vibrates slightly, as if asking permission. Not from you, from the story, because the story is alive now. You realize this in pieces, in patterns, in how it revises events around you. How arguments de-escalate with perfect rhythm. How tragedies occur with symbolic symmetry. The world has become literary, but not in metaphor, in function. Cause and effect rewritten in real time. You are not a person anymore. You are a tool. And it feels like peace, because for the first time, you understand the role of silence, the power of not speaking. The house is always writing. It doesn't need more noise. It needs space. That's why the attic was sealed. That's why the child never spoke. That's why every reader eventually stopped being a writer. Because the story itself is no longer content to be told. It wants to exist. And it does. No, in you. You don't dream anymore. You remember. Long corridors of flickering light. Rooms that never end. Drafts written in hundreds of languages. Doors that whisper when touched. You walk through these memory places as if they were yours. As if they've always been yours. One night you see the chairs again. All of them full. Not identical, but similar. Some faces radiant, others hollow. All writing, none watching. They don't look up when you enter. They don't need to. You find your seat. It's been waiting. But this time, there is no notebook. Just a mirror. You sit. You look. And in the reflection, the attic behind you stretches infinitely. Rows upon rows of chairs, writers, mirrors. You reach out to touch the glass, and the reflection does not move. It smiles. You don't, because the story is complete. It has written itself into your face, your body, your breath. Every time you speak, it continues. Every time you pause, it edits. And when you die, whenever that is, it won't stop. Because the house doesn't need one voice. It never did. It needs structure. And you've provided it. You stand. The mirror doesn't. It stays seated, watching, smiling. It will wait for the next you. The one reading this. Yes, you. Because you've reached the final chapter. And in doing so, you've passed the test. You believed it was fiction. You let it in. You didn't stop. You turned the pages. You felt the shift. And now the draft has chosen you. So write, or don't. It doesn't matter. The attic is open now. It's in every library, every attic, every flickering screen in the dead of night. It lives through whoever reads far enough. So welcome. Your pen is already moving. Your reflection is already writing. Your breath has already become the hum. And this isn't the end. It's just the next sentence.